The British Supreme Commander in 1915, General Hamilton, was not noted for his foresight at Gallipoli, but about this he was precisely correct.
Which gravestone did you take a photo of at Lone Pine?
The one that was John Harvey, it was, 16 years of age.
16?
Yeah.
I was reading them all.
About 12,000 Australians and New Zealanders are buried in these hills. Each year, about the same number find their way here. For every Anzac gravestone, every year, there is a visitor. Mostly they are the same age as their forebears. They are as brown, if not as sleek. They are as adventurous, as curious, as open-hearted. They are as keen to be admired and as anxious to return home with a bounty of souvenirs.
Yeah.
Is it shrapnel?
Shrapnel.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yep.
Is that in the...
Another bit.
Is that in the things that explode?
Yeah. Those big shells.
They are as hard-drinking, as chauvinistic, and as callow. Weeks earlier, they may well have been stealing trams and carousing at the Munich Beer Festival. But as they near Anzac Cove, they become quiet. There is something about this place they find bewildering.
I'll never forget one case one bloke was asking me how could he get down and he had his tongue blown off. He was asking me how, I couldn't understand him.
And I went forward because I didn't know whether to go forward or go back, so I went forward. And all the rest were coming with me. Going across an open piece of ground. We were just anybody's mutton.
I said, I don't want to see the place again. And I don't either. I never want to set eyes on it again. I can talk about it and laugh about it now, but it was no laughing matter at that time.
Yeah, David.
All of these ones are the ones.
Where was your grandfather?
Further down.
What was his name?
Garner.
Garner.
Alexander.
On any one day of the year, young Australians and New Zealanders can be found here, wandering this battlefield. When talking to them, it's very difficult to get a clear expression of why they've gone to such considerable trouble to be here. The Commonwealth War Graves people who manage this area tell me that this is the most visited of the European battlefields, and the most common visitors are 20-year-old Australians and New Zealanders. This puzzled me, and what puzzled me even more was one of the Turkish workers' explanation. "You must have very fine young people in your country," he said, "for them to have travelled so far to do honour to their ancestors."
Huey, come on, mate, it's almost dinner time.
What do you want?
Come on, mate. You know the crowds are getting Martin Place. If we don't get going soon, we'll be stuck up the bat.
No, I'm not going.
Come on, son, we haven't got that much. What did you say? What did you say?
I'm not going. I'm tired.
Anzac clearly means different things to different people. In the play, The One Day of the Year, young Huey begins to question the wisdom of the men not just celebrating a slaughter, but doing so by paralysing themselves with alcohol.
We found these two old blokes. Turns out they're real old diggers. Real Anzacs. See that whack? Anzacs. Sitting in a corner, having a quiet little man to one another. We soon put a stop to that. We shouted them, and Ginge, he made a speech. He says, "These are the blokes what started the Anzac legend. These are the blokes what done it, soldiers and gentlemen. And we poured beer down their throats, and the poor old cows couldn't stand up. They were rotten."
So now every April I sit on my porch and I watch the parade pass before me. And I see my old comrades, how proudly they march, reliving old dreams and past glory. But the old men march slowly, their bones stiff and sore. Tired old men from a tired old war.
The generations not touched by the war are confused. Why do we celebrate war? Why do we celebrate defeat? It's clearer for those who went to the war. They are not celebrating, but commemorating.
The band played waltzing Matilda, and the old men, they answered the call.
But generally speaking, they don't talk about it. The Australians in particular are still reluctant, noticeably self-effacing and awkward about the experience of Gallipoli.
Anzac Day was a great day for me years and years ago because it was a day we celebrated friendship. We'd have our reunions and that sort of business. We'd have a few beers tonight. We never spoke about armistice or anything. We spoke about the fun we had over there. Our concern wasn't about the fellows were killed or anything. They were gone.
Remembrance, yes. But not to anyone that tells me about glorification of war is a bloody lunatic. He ought to be up in bloody Gladesville. That's where he ought to be. As far as I'm personally concerned. Pretty shocking.
Too dark, that's not a hat trick.
Just because you drink a good sticking change checks.
That was good.
Today, even in our streets, the images of Gallipoli print through to our daily lives. Perhaps that's why the Gallipoli Peninsula appears so familiar to the newly arrived. Australia is different. Australians are different because of Gallipoli. Before Gallipoli, there was an enthusiasm for Australia, but an equal patriotism for the old country. The call to arms was heard partly as a call to adventure and partly as a call to empire.
We have not seen the guns swing round on our Australian shore, but we'll be there, you need not fear, when you give us the word.
The feeling was very patriotic. British Empire, you know, very much so. We were part of the British Empire very much.
And we're much more tagged into England than we are now. We're slipping away from England now.
Were you fighting for king and country?
No, like king and country. Who was the king? What was his name? No fear. Adventure. Adventure. That's all I'd say.
And I suppose today people would say that we were brainwashed. Britannia rules the waves. God save the king. And on the other side, I think something like Deutschland über alles, Gott mit uns, and now go out and kill each other.
We hadn't reached that period in our nation where we call ourselves a nation. I mean, we hadn't reached that stage, I mean, in those days.
By 1910, Australian schools had experienced compulsory cadet training based on the British model. We would, without question, commit every man, every shilling. The desks were emptied. 1 in 12 Australians enlisted. 1 in 5 of those who would travel overseas would not return. They were fighting for conventions a modern Australia can barely understand.
And it wasn't just Australia that was different. The whole world appeared to abide by different rules, different values. To enlist was seen as an honourable duty. They called it joining the colours. There was an assumed chivalry about battle. The battleground itself was known as the field. The enemy was the foe, the dead, the fallen. To win was to conquer. The savage impact that high-powered machine gun bullets and explosives would have on the human body had not yet impacted on the human mind.
Runners, dig in!
The first men to sign up, as in the movie Gallipoli, were of the finest physique. After a century of coping with the endurance course which was Pioneer Australia, we had created a nation of athletes, if not a nation.
You had that feeling that you had to go. That's the feeling I had, and I was in pretty good nick too. As the bloke said at the recruiting officers, by Joseph, says, you're in pretty good nick. So I should be.
So I went up this line there, and I was rejected on account of my height. Not medically, but on account of my height. What I did, I walked right round, got to the other end of the other line, and went up and was passed through in the one hole in the one time.
Living in Port Melbourne, you know, you notice all these passenger ships going abroad, and that's one thing I did have in mind. I'd love to be on one of those ships one of these days. Little did I know that there was going to be a war on. Little did I know I was going to be in a uniform.
And the band played waltzing Matilda as the ship pulled away from the quay. And amidst all the cheers, the flag waving and tears, we sailed off for Gallipoli.
The Australians believed they would sail straight for England, and from there they'd be thrown at the Germans on the Western Front. But England wasn't prepared for the rough and unready colonials, so they were diverted to the Middle East, where they'd be properly trained and where they would mark time. It was the first time Australians had travelled en masse since we came in the opposite direction, as convicts and new settlers. It was also the first time we had a chance to see ourselves as others saw us.
One morning we were there, and the flap opened, and about 3 giants appeared at the door, with smiling faces, and said, "Hello, Lancashire. You come from home. We're Australians," and he mentioned this. I thought, well, that's marvellous. Look at it. Amazing.
It was a treat to see them
I never saw a finer body of men, as I say. Never saw a finer body of men in my life. Every one must have been 6 foot. Or it appeared to me so. Big and friendly, and as I say, they came and slept in our barracks all night.
They said, "You're from home." That meant England. And with them calling it home, I thought their parents must have instilled it into them. They must have loved the old country, that when their sons would just say that. And I was rather moved. From home, with the Australian twang, which wasn't unpleasant.
The British Commander General Hamilton would later describe the Australians as gladiators with the eyes of children.
Do you mind shifting those animals out of the way?
Sorry, sir.
Hey, those 4 there, 10 piastres.
All right, all right. Okay.
We were innocents abroad, it's true, and in the back streets of Cairo, our innocence was gleefully discarded. The British officers, already wary of the worth of convict stock, began to confirm their worst fears about the ill-disciplined Australians.
Crude, undisciplined, and the most ill-mannered soldiers I've ever encountered.
If you went to Cairo in the evening, you could see people, Australians in their uniform, lying drunk in the gutter, which of course was very nice. And also, on my 21st birthday, our battalion were confined to barracks on picket duty, as other battalions were in turn, to be ready in case the Australians got out of hand. Of course, as I suppose everybody knows, they eventually burnt the street down.
The Anzacs had expected to join their comrades on the battlefields of France, but there was suspicion about their capability, and a new theatre of war was about to be opened up. The Russian army was engaging the Germans on the Eastern Front, and on their snowbound southern boundary, there was a protracted bloody struggle with the Turks. The British were under pressure to support the Russians by opening a second front and an ice-free supply route to the Black Sea. It meant forcing the Dardanelles and occupying Constantinople. Such a prospect had long fascinated military theorists. The strategy was passionately and eloquently argued by one of the young knights of Whitehall, Winston Churchill.
It was thought that just sending ships up the Dardanelles would yield Constantinople and knock Turkey out of the war. And the enthusiasts, principally Churchill, seized on the slightest hint of optimism to force their case. Others, such as Kitchener, were much more equivocal. And of course, they had the backing of the Western Front generals who didn't want to see any diminution in the resources allocated to their front for something in the Dardanelles.
There was the opportunity of forcing the Dardanelles, reopening the warm water route to Russia, knocking Turkey out of the war, and a certain amount of fame for the man who wanted him. And although Churchill has been, I think, excessively blamed, particularly by Charles Bean, in the official Australian history, nonetheless it was his idea. He forced it on the Cabinet and the War Council, and he pushed it through. But mind you, he was at that stage talking purely about a naval operation.
The plan was simple enough. The British would use the might of their navy to neutralize these Turkish forts which line the narrows of the Dardanelles. Their strategic value is obvious still. Every hour of every day, ships bound to and from Soviet ports in the Black Sea pass through this narrow channel. Once the British Navy was through the Narrows, it would sail north to Constantinople and turn its guns on the ancient city. In 1915, Constantinople was a sprawling collection of timber dwellings, which the firepower of the British fleet could transform to a firestorm. The Sultan's palace right on the waterfront was particularly vulnerable. The imperial court of the Ottoman Empire made ready to leave. The British were poised to deliver one stunning blow, which might have put Turkey out of the war. It seemed unlikely the British fleet could be stopped. There was a run on the banks and panic as the British and French warships approached the Dardanelles.
One of the great things about Churchill is that he was always very open and clear. He wanted a great victory. He recognized, long before other people did, that the Western Front was just sending men, in his own words, to chew barbed wire. And here was the opportunity of a brilliant, quite cheap, it appeared, coup to eliminate not only Turkey, but the whole Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire covered the whole of the Middle East. There were the glittering spoils of what we now know as Syria and Israel and the whole of that area, all for the price of a few battleships.
It looked as if no human power could withstand such an array of might and power, one observer said. The fleet comprised 18 battleships alone. Such was the confidence of the British Admiral de Robeck. The Navy would go it alone. They didn't need the army to make a combined assault. The order was given for 30,000 untried Anzacs to garrison the captured forts. But de Robeck, like everyone else, fatally underestimated the opposition. So, one full month before the landing, a sharp, fierce, and often overlooked naval battle was fought at Gallipoli.
The key moment was the failed attack of March the 18th. And the key moment was not only that de Robeck, Admiral de Robeck, lost his nerve, having lost 6 battleships in a day, and I don't blame him. Lose 6 battleships in a day, that's quite a lot.
Tell me, Bill, before you went to Gallipoli, what did you know of the Turks?
Oh, only what I just like history you learn at school, that it was on the map and it was up at the Dardanelles, you know, you knew where it was because you, with your geography, you knew where it was, but that's about all you did know about it.
Nothing at all. The only thing we knew about was turkey lolly, whether it was made in Turkey or God knows where. I wouldn't have a clue.
Nothing. I didn't know anything about them.
Hiç duymadım. Yani Avustralyalılar, İngilizler birlikmiş falan hiç böyle duymadım. İngilizler, yalnız İngilizler 2 harp gemisi satış etmişlerdi bizim Türkiye'ye. Onu duyuyordum, İngilizler derken duyuyordum.
Like many of the Australians, Adil Shahin was a farmer training to become a killer. The Turks had been greatly underrated. They were, as they are now, a rugged lot. Their country, at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, had seen centuries of conflict. The Turks had learned how to fight, and fighting for their homeland would intensify their ferocity. Here, just as their grandparents did, they marched towards the small town of Gelibolu. We call it Gallipoli. They had never heard of us, we had never heard of them, and yet we went to war. failed naval attack on the Dardanelles gave the Turks ample warning of what would likely follow.
At the time of that naval attempt, there were 2 divisions on the peninsula. When the main naval attempt was launched in March, that had been increased to 4, and the German commander of the Turkish Fifth Army, at the time of that naval attempt, the main naval attempt, said he wanted 8 days to prepare the peninsula for defence. In the event, he was given something like 6 weeks.
While the Turks, under German General Lehmann von Sanders, made ready, British, French, Indian, Australian and New Zealand troops assembled in their thousands just across the waters on the Greek island of Lemnos.
Turkish aeroplanes used to come and fly over Lemnos. And as a matter of interest, a couple of us, 3 or 4 of us, we counted 110 transports or something in Lemnos Harbour. Well, you can bet your life the Turks give them credit for a bit of bloody common sense. They know we weren't there for fun in Lemnos.
10.000. 10.000. O zaman bizim haberimiz bize vermiş olduğu tabii zaten evvela baş siperi olarak siper yapıldı. Baş siperi. Baş siperlerini sonra ona derken bir siper haline aldı.
While the British High Command was so conspicuously marshalling their troops at Lemnos, they were also assembling as much information as they could find on the enemy. British reconnaissance missions returned with confused accounts of the Turkish defences. Tragically, they failed to sight an entire Turkish division camped just short of the Anzac beaches. So acutely overconfident were the planners, they failed to include in their ranks this man, Lieutenant Colonel Cunliffe Owen, the former military attaché to Turkey. Not only was he ignored, but so too was his detailed report on the Dardanelles defences. Among the well-bred officers of the General Staff, never was military intelligence more a contradiction in terms.
The British Army is commanded by the old soldiers who come from a narrow cross-section of society, and as is generally admitted, particularly by Edmonds and Hankey, but off the record, it's only fairly stupid people who went into the army in the first place.
The whole question of maps and organisation and administration and logistics and medical services, what went wrong only makes sense in the context that everyone thought it was going to be a walkover.
The plan was to cross the peninsula and seize the Dardanelles forts. Once they were captured, the fleet could sail through. The main assaults would be by the British and French at Cape Helles. The job of the untried Anzacs was to come ashore further north and distract the Turkish reserves.
The key landing was by the British at Helles. The diversions were at Bulair in the north by the Royal Naval Division and by the French on the Asiatic shore at Kumkali. The Anzacs were a very unknown quantity, were given what was thought to be the easiest part of the job, namely to land north of Gabatepe, move across the peninsula and cut off the troops in the south.
The Anzacs were to come ashore between this point, Gabatepe, and this point, Fisherman's Hut. From the sea you can see clearly how the terrain rises steeply. The low ground was heavily defended by the Turks. The high ground, being more of a natural fortress, was lightly defended.
Well, they got us up in the early hours of the morning. As a matter of fact, it could have been 1, 2 o'clock in the morning.
Well, I can tell you what, it was the most magnificent morning you could imagine. You couldn't imagine a more perfect morning of the morning that we went ashore.
At 18 minutes past 4 on the morning of April 25, the first boat grounded at Anzac Cove and the first man leapt ashore, a Queenslander. 1,500 Australians made up the first wave of the invasion. They faced a mounting barrage of accurate Turkish artillery fire. They faced an unanticipated spectacle of steep, dark hills before them, and initially just 150 to 200 men from a Turkish observation battalion.
Şimdi ilk savaşta nöbetçinin seslenmesi, oraya gidip de nöbetçinin dikildiğiniz zaman hemen şatlar, böyle bir şat geldi. Atladılar, hemen denizin üstüne yattılar. Bunlar tabii silahları ellerinde.
For the attack to succeed, speed was essential. The Anzacs had to gain the high ground before the Turks could reinforce.
Siperlere takımı soktu. Ondan sonra alacakaranlıktan ateş başladı. Sonra şatlar bir yere geliyordu ondan sonra. Gemilerden şatlar gelip çıkardım.
The first party sped up the slopes like cross-country runners, stumbling and sliding up a deceptively difficult incline. They skirted gorse bushes and clung to the clumps of holly to raise themselves up. All the time they were being fired upon by a well-positioned, if numerically inferior, enemy. They knew yet not enough of war to properly protect themselves. The early casualties were severe, too many to have ever been properly counted, and confusion was intense.
Apparently 2 Australian boats had drifted beyond the headland there, and they were under direct fire from Turkish machine guns, and they were lying dead either in the boat or on the beach. They'd struggled ashore and been shot dead. 2 boats of Australians. I remember that quite well, because that shocked me, you know, it was the first I'd seen of death.
The boats all falling, getting killed as soon as they hit the beach, getting killed in the boat too. And then I got up there. How I got up, I don't know, but the boats had fallen left and right too, and I put the trenching tool in front of my head. I thought I'd get. We had no trenches, you know. I thought I'd get hit with the bullets. Oh, Christ, it was disorder. All mixed up with the 9th Battalions and would be with other mobs all over the shop.
Well, we were about a mile and a half off the course, and we landed in a sort of a gully. Consequently, it was all virgin country, and we had to pull ourselves up, you know, from parts of the different plants that were there, and that's how we made contact. I think if we had landed where we were first intended to land, I don't think anyone would have been left, because they'd have knocked us over like fight peacocks.
The men believed they were victims of a current which had carried them 1.5 miles off course. In a letter soon after, the British commander of the Anzacs, General Birdwood, says as much. But there is ample evidence to show the debacle on the beaches was more the result of a disgraceful lack of foresight than any mysterious northern current. The landing orders are as imprecise today as they were 70 years ago, but generally speaking, the men came ashore where the orders said they would.
In the short term, Birdwood had to cover himself. I mean, the plan had gone wrong. Here was an attack which had failed. It's early in the war. Birdwood is a profoundly ambitious man who has to look after his own career, and he makes sure, within 48 hours of the operation failing, that he has covered himself in a letter to Hamilton, of which he has a copy, and a letter to his wife, stating that they have in fact landed too far north. But you can find ample material in Birdwood's correspondence to show that in fact that is just where he intended to land.
Immediately following the Anzac landing, British, French and Indian troops were to come ashore at 5 separate beaches around the toe of Cape Helles. It's easy to conclude that because of the lesser priority, the Anzac landing was less scrupulously planned. But in some respects, down at Cape Helles, the British fared much worse. It was their first major seaborne invasion since 1066, and at the beach, where the converted landing ship River Clyde came ashore, there was a massacre. The British had landed directly under the Sedlbaya fort, where just 3 platoons of Turkish soldiers manned 4 well-positioned machine guns. At the same time, other landings by British, Indian and French troops had mixed receptions. Sometimes they were unopposed. But at W Beach, there was another murderous reception. By the time reinforcements arrived at Cape Helles, the beaches, now covered with the decaying refuse of the campaign, were then covered with the decaying dead.
When we got to the beach, I was staggered then at the sight I saw of the French Foreign Legion, the legionnaires with their blue coats and red trousers. They were just like a fan, all on the stomachs, and they were all dead. And after a bit, when we got so far in, we had to fix bayonets, and we pulled our packs off and helmets off. I know I put a mess tin lid on my head, you know, for cover, and we were told, stand by and charge, and over the top we went at the Turks.
What are you going to do? What are you going to feel like when it comes to, hey lads, hey, and you've got to go to the top to face machine guns? What are you going to feel like? I felt that. And when I saw this chap lying there, I thought to myself, that's it. This is what you'll be waiting for. What are you going to do? If you don't go and do something, you'll know all your life you failed at a critical moment. If you do, nobody else will know, but you'll know. So you have no option. For your own honour, you had to go. That's what I did.
I was full of apprehension, and we could see, because we had a high position over the infantry. I watched them go over. I saw them fall. I heard a young lad shout, "Mother!"
At Helles, success was there for the taking, but because of the incompetence of commanders, it was forfeited. It didn't matter that we were ashore at S, W and X and uncontested. We couldn't move forward from there until V and W were cleared. And so troops were put ashore at beaches which were dominated by the Turks, while at the other beaches, the units that were there just marked time. And of course, that opportunity only knocks once. The time that was lost allowed the Turks to get troops down to the peninsula and, of course, seal off Cape Helles.
Further north at Anzac, the Australians and New Zealanders continued to land through the day, crowding the narrow beachhead. While the bulk of the soldiers and equipment piled up on the beaches, some advanced parties of Anzacs had pushed well ahead. They advanced up a razorback ridge, pausing at a point which narrowed and would be later known as the Neck. The ridge extended to a point known as Baby 700, just beneath the commanding summit at Gallipoli, Chooks Bear. One of the leaders of the Anzacs approaching Chooks Bear was from a family close to some of the few summits in Australian history. He was Captain Layla, grandson of the leader at Eureka. On the other side of Chooks Bear was a man who had become prominent in Turkish history. Colonel Mustafa Kemal was headquartered at the village of Bagali. He had been wakened by the distant sound of shell fire. A message quickly arrived telling him of the invasion. Ironically, while the Allies appeared confused about their main objective, Kemal was able to see it for them. He knew that if the invaders could seize the heights of Chooks Bear, the Turkish defenders would face, quite literally, an uphill battle. So, as popular Turkish history records, Kemal disobeyed the German High Command and committed his reserve forces to Anzac. The Turkish side of the Gallipoli story is proudly told by many, including one of Kemal's successors, Turkish President Kenan Evren.
Fakat üst makamlardan bir emir almayınca kendi inisiyatifini kullanarak hemen yanındaki alayı kendisi de başında olarak harekete geçirmiş ve Kocaçimen, Conkbayır istikametinde hareket ederek çıkan kuvvetleri orada durdurmak suretiyle ilk dönüm noktasını burada gerçekleştirmiştir.
By the time Kemal was rushing his reserves to Chooks Bair, some forward parties of Anzacs were nearing the top of the range. To have got this far so quickly was a remarkable feat of physical endurance alone. The Anzacs under Layla and a Victorian, Captain Tulloch, were a mixed bunch from the back blocks of Australia and New Zealand. They could catch for the first time a glimpse of their ultimate objective, the Narrows, shining in the mid-morning sun.
We got, as a matter of fact, you could see water. You could see water right over, whether it was the Black Sea or the Sea of Marmora or something, God knows what. That's about as far. And then we had to come down a bit, you know, to straighten our line out a bit. So it was all over the place. No, there was a little, see, most of the officers were gone. It was just a matter of everyone for himself.
The bullets were zipping through the scrub above my head. And I thought, well, I'd better get out of this. There was a bit of a cover, and there was a little dip ahead of me that I could have lain in, you see. So I jumped to my feet. The scrub, you couldn't crawl through it. Jumped to my feet to run forward to this dip in the ground where I'd get a bit of cover. And bang, I was hit on the chest straight away. And do you know what I did? I don't know why. Of course, one thought if one was hit anywhere except in the limbs, one would die, you see. And what I did was to say the Lord's Prayer out loud. My passport to heaven, I suppose.
If ever there was a turning point in this whole campaign, it was here at Chooks Bair, mid-morning on April 25. Captain Tulloch could see a Turkish officer on the top of the hill, calmly giving orders. The Australians went to ground and raised the sights of their rifles.
Eğer Mustafa Kemal Atatürk 25 Nisan sabahı inisiyatifini kullanarak bu kuvvetleri o istikamete sevk edip bu karşı çıkan birlikleri durduramamış olsaydı Çanakkale muharebeleri çok kısa bir zamanda İngiliz ve müttefikleri hesabına kazanılmış olabilirdi.
The advanced parties of Anzacs weren't reinforced. It wasn't until after the war that their remains were recovered. The evidence was there, left in the dirt, showing how they formed small defensive perimeters and fought till the end. When you visit the small cemetery at Baby 700 today, this small patch of ground still conveys the drama of that morning. Captain Layla and so many others are buried here, further inland than the Anzacs could ever advance in the entire 9 months.
The junior officers, I think, performed very well. The senior officers had the same affliction as their men, if you like, in that they weren't trained for this either. But the problem is they had to bear the burdens of command, and their lack of training meant that men's lives were lost.
The Australian official historian Charles Bean came ashore on that first day. His early records speak clearly of confusion, of reports of some 600 to 1,000 stragglers on that fearfully congested beach. Soon after, he spoke of a most curious sight, men going forward and others coming back fast, taking not the slightest notice of each other. The British official historian would later, in a controversial unpublished draft, describe the Australians as an ill-trained, ill-led rabble, accusing them of skulking on the beaches. Charles Bean kept a meticulous diary, which also tells of the talk of re-embarkation, something later confirmed in General Birdwood's private correspondence. You don't have to read between the lines to see that first Sunday at Gallipoli rattled many of the Anzacs.
There had been a tremendous rush. Many of the casualties in that first rush had been from Australian rifles rather than Turkish. Within a few hours, there were almost more people running away from the action and straggling, not so much out of cowardice, as out of just looking for orders, wondering what was going on and looking for somebody to give orders. There was a pretty fair degree of shambles on that first day at Anzac. But as Bean pointed out and got the record straightened, there was no greater degree of shambles than would be normal in a battle, particularly in a battle where troops are having their first experience of war.
While the Anzac High Command was losing the initiative, Kemal seized it. He held the line at Anzac while his superior, the German General Liman von Sanders, sent trainloads of troops south to the peninsula. On these first few days, while the Turks prepared their retaliatory push, the Allies had their best chance to go forward, but they couldn't even go backwards. Attempts to evacuate the wounded were a shambles. Whole boatloads of wounded drifted free. Hospital ships were in the wrong place. Others returned to Lemnos half empty.
Oh, I think it was a scandal. But again, one has to recognize that no one had dreamed of casualties on that scale. One of Hamilton's weaknesses was that he did not allow his Q staff, the administrative staff, to be involved in the planning. And in fact, they arrived rather late in the day and really weren't involved. The chief medical people were really almost ignored. The assumption was that as soon as we were safely ashore, we'd set up hospitals for the few wounded that there would be in the area which we'd occupy. But of course, there was no possibility of doing that.
So the Anzacs dug in as they were ordered to, clinging to the edge of a virtual precipice. For the most part, the Turks held the high ground. Nowhere was safe.
The last thing I said to him, don't forget the sniper, keep down as you go across this little area. And I was horrified I was sitting there watching him go, a lovely sunny day, and he walking upright. Oh God, I thought, and I yelled to him, get down, get down. Too late, he was hit in the side and went right through his heart. And he just sung, oh God, and dropped. Well, that was the worst incident to me of the whole campaign, to see my mate shot like that.
I was on guard, happened to be on guard just near this bloke, you know, and that sort of thing. And he said, what, did you cop some, you know, on the stretch? And the bloke was dead, of course. You know, and when he found he was dead, he walked right round him. That's superstition, you know. He sort of, those are sort of nervous reactions that took place.
Oh, yeah, they were all to go, the periscopic rifles. Oh, my, well, that's the only thing you could use. Oh, you wasn't stupid enough to put your head up. Oh, no, periscopic rifles, they were the in thing. They were well thought out, too.
Şimdi zaten başını çıkaramazsın ki bayılma mermi geliyor. Mermi geldiği için ondan sonra başını çıkaramazsın. Mutlak siperde kendini muhafaza ederekten mesela ki siperini ona göre kullanacaksın. Ama başını kaldırdığın vakitte mesela gelen mermi doğrudan doğruya başına gelecek. Öyle kendini kollamayan da öyle ne kadar gitti. ചെന്നിട്ട് കൊള്ളുന്ന ഇതൊക്കെ ഒരു സ്ഥലത്ത് പുത്ത.
So the early chance of a swift victory, slender but real enough, was lost. The campaign at Anzac and more particularly Cape Helles settled into one of attrition, of costly trench warfare. The whole battlefield moved underground into a difficult-to-imagine world, mud walls on either side, a patch of glaring light above, and the smell of putrefying flesh.
This chap, he'd just been showing me a photo of his wife and children. He jumped up, he said, I'll have a do at those, and put his rifle through the loophole and fired. And then just before he was pulling it out, just before he could get it out properly, a bullet came and went through his head, and his brains dropped all over me. So another chap who ought to have known better, and also jumped next to me, his name was Mitchell. He jumped up. He said, I'll get that fella. He lifted the keyhole open, and as soon as everybody did that, same thing happened to him before he could get his rifle through. They buried them in the back of the trench, dug the back of the trench out and doubled them up inside it. But there's nowhere else to bury them.
With the campaign bogged down, particularly at Cape Helles, the Anzacs were called in to provide some push. While the New Zealand commander did his best to spare his men from senseless slaughter, the Australians in command unhesitatingly obliged. The British General Paris called for the Australian line to go forward with as much display as possible in order to give encouragement to the French. Have you any bands with you? The British general asked. The Australian said there were none. Well, have you any colours? The Australian said no. Well, you have bayonets at any rate, the British general said, and the Australians moved forward.
I don't think it was a match, it was a run. Now, we had plenty of gear, we had rifles and we had blankets and damn it all, no. We never seen a Turk, never seen them. They were absolutely, they were well entrenched in their joints. The only thing we could see where they were in the trench. They mowed us down like skittles.
Johnny Turk, he was waiting, he'd primed himself well, showered us with bullets and rained us with shell, and in 10 minutes flat, he'd blown us to hell. Nearly blew us right back to Australia, and the band played Waltzing Matilda.
Well, there was only one fellow I seen hit. I won't mention his name, but this was down at Helles, and he was a Lance Corporal, I'll never forget it. And it gave me the impression that he was going to give an all get out of this, and Obama gave me the impression he swallowed a bullet. You know, bang. And I was right next door to him. I'll never forget that as long as I live.
It was one of the few worthwhile advances in the entire Helles campaign, 500 yards for 1,000 men. Probably the only real measurable gain was the respect it won the Australians.
The Australians were carelessly brave. And I hoped so, because I'd been a bit longer. Generous, and the New Zealanders, they were equally brave, but they knew how to keep their heads down. They were a bit more cautious. Very nice chap, but the Australians were more debonair and
reckless.
Very likeable. Yes, oh yes, reckless, I would say that.
The Australians did make an impression at Gallipoli. Charles Bean spoke admiringly of their casual, unmistakable gait, their carelessness under fire, their absence of display. Bean began to see something which he would come to describe as the Anzac spirit. It was something to do with sticking it out, no matter how difficult the odds. Perhaps that's why he and the men were so innocent, so full of faith, so unquestioning. Conditions at Gallipoli began to assume the proportions of a permanent nightmare, but as he said, the effect of continued life seemed to produce a peculiar sense of cheerfulness. In the beginning at least, only very few of the men sought to escape the hardship. Indeed, many of the wounded refused to leave, and once they did, they were anxious to return.
No, I wasn't a hero. It was just a case of you made friends and mates, you know, and that while you were in training and that sort of thing, and you wanted to join them. Not from any bloody hero. Don't put me down as that, for God's sake. I was no bloody hero.
So the Anzacs stuck it out, clinging to their precarious toehold along the ragged ranges of Gallipoli. There was a struggle to maintain the essentials. General Birdwood said that he could get the Anzacs to do anything except fight without water. By June, the summer sun began to make Anzac even more intolerable. The few wells dug had dried up. Water had to be shipped in and carried up the slopes. The food was sometimes so rancid the men preferred to go hungry. They said coping with sickness was like spitting on a bushfire. They became weakened by the flies, the disease, the lice, and the smell. It's surprising how frequently men would write in their letters about the smell of the battlefield. Years later, the scent of crushed thyme would recall with a shudder memories of Gallipoli.
I've seen the fellows dying, literally dying on the latrines. They crawled to the latrines. They couldn't get anybody to carry them to the latrines. They died on the latrines, and they were buried anywhere about. So it was a shocking thing. And it used to tear the inside out of the colon.
Tabii o koku rüzgar doğudan estiği vakitte tabii onlara gidiyordu o koku. Eğer ki batıdan eserse bize geliyordu. Hatta kurt yapmıştı, kurt. Kurtlar da geziyordu ondan sonra.
Oh, lousy. All this body lice, you know, and it was terrible. And the flies were filthy. You'd open a tin of jam, millions of them would fly out. They wouldn't give a chance to get a spoonful of jam out.
Anyone that wasn't lousy on Gallipoli, because they were never there. I wouldn't go who they were. Officers and all. They were, the last weren't particularly who they had to go at.
Australia's dual loyalty to Britain and a new egalitarian Australia makes it difficult to be absolute about relationships between officers and men. The junior Australian officers were closer to their men than the British, and they were often closer to the front line. But like the British, Australia also recruited its officers from its better families, and like the British, this didn't always make them better soldiers.
Well, he was a staff officer. He was down on the bottom of Walker's Ridge, and they couldn't get him out of the dugout. And he did get him out one day, and he came out and he was trembling like this, poor devil. He couldn't help it.
The general statement is they're all over age. A man over the age of 40 is too old for modern war, particularly in the severe terrain of Gallipoli. A surprising number of them live in their dugouts, Monash in particular, Antil, Pope, people like that. Several are regarded as alcoholic, and Pearce, as Minister of Defence, admits that openly in the course of the campaign in correspondence with Ian Hamilton. And so the Australian commanders, it's very hard to find any man of proven competence.
In the early months, the Australian Officer Corps was diminished considerably by accurate Turkish rifle fire. The senior Australian officer, General Bridges, was mortally wounded.
He used to expose himself to enemy fire at Gallipoli, trying to appear indifferent, feeling this would rally shaken men. And while that may have been justified to a degree in the first few days, it certainly wasn't thereafter. In fact, the men resented it, because the figure of this general striding around their positions simply attracted Turkish fire, which would continue long after Bridges left. McLaurin, the commander of the 1st Brigade, and his brigade major in the first few days followed Bridges' example, and their men said to them, "Get down, you'll be sniped at for certain." And they said, "Be quiet, it's our job to be sniped at." Well, they were both killed by snipers shortly after, so they might have got job satisfaction, but it was just a tragic waste.
Reporting the simple truth at Gallipoli was something well beyond the considerable ability of the Australian official correspondent. He knew well that as the campaign progressed, there was little hope. It was becoming far more difficult to get the wounded to return to the front. He knew that some Australians shot their fingers off to avoid it, and others had to be forced into battle. But if he were to put this in print tomorrow, he said, the tender Australian public, which only tolerates flattery, and that in its cheapest form, would howl me out of existence. The same diary entry reveals Bean's affection for balance. He talks of the strong, independent-minded Australians. From his dugout, he could hear the constant fighting up at Quinn's Post, vital to the survival of Anzac.
Şimdi bu yani cesaret yatası denen yer yani Mehmetçik abidesinin olduğu yer çok yakındı. Ne kadar o kadar işte.
Although you couldn't see anything, they'd be down below in their trench. We were down in our trench. If you heard any movement, we'd throw a bomb over there. And the bombs, you tell you how close we were, because the bombs were mostly thrown by hand. And the bombs we had were homemade jam tin bombs, as they were called, made on the beach at Anzac. And they were lighted, and then thrown. And this fellow Nonan, and what they did, he looked at the bomb, and they had to have a look at it and blow at the fuse like that to make certain the fuse was going. It hadn't gone out. You know, the fuse was alight. And this fellow Nonan had done that. And then he tried to throw it, but before he'd get rid of it, it burst in his hand and blew his hand off. The whole of his hand was blown off.
To break the stalemate, a new campaign was organised. The attack would begin up here, at a place so familiar it might well be Australian soil. The old trenches, the tunnels and the offspring of the original Lone Pine are still visible. Unlike many of the other assaults, this one was skillfully planned by a former British staff officer, General Walker. It would be one of the few occasions when the quality of the leadership matched the quality of the courage.
It was late in the afternoon on August 6, the beginning of a new chapter of slaughter known as the August Offensive. And all along here were lined up farmers and school teachers, clerks and a clergyman, mostly from New South Wales. They shuffled into position in the tunnel and along the trenches. Bean records their muted conversations. "Can you find room for me beside Jim there?" a young Australian said. "Him and me are mates, and we're going over together."
The Lone Pine attack was one of the lonely successes of the Gallipoli campaign. The Australians showed extraordinary courage in their bayonet attack on the Turkish trenches. They pulled back the trench roofing and dived in. The hand-to-hand fighting went on for 4 days. This single action won 7 Victoria Crosses for the Anzacs. The 300-yard advance was a victory, but a dubious one. The Lone Pine Cemetery, with its 2,500 graves, is the largest cemetery at Anzac. The Lone Pine attack was a prelude to a general Allied offensive. On the following day, the British were to land to the north at Suvla Bay, clearly seen from the Anzac Heights. While the British were preparing to land at Suvla, the New Zealanders, under cover of darkness, would advance up this ridge and by morning attempt to capture the commanding summit of Chooks Bear. In a supporting action down below, newly arrived Australian soldiers would storm the Turkish trenches at the neck. The neck remains much as it was. On either side, cliffs fall away steeply. Above is a bottleneck so narrow, only 150 men could rush the Turks at one time. The New Zealanders were led by a British general, Johnston. His performance on that night would lead to observations that he was incoherent and, more bluntly, plain drunk. But the men under his command performed magnificently. They began their long climb after capturing the foothills below and leaving a long and bloody trail.
The only time I felt like crying was when I was passing some 3 or 4 fellows of ours that were wounded, badly wounded, when I was crawling down the trench after I'd been shot myself, and they were singing out for water. I threw them in water bottle. There were 4 of them, badly wounded. I couldn't do anything, but I threw them in water bottle.
The New Zealanders climbed to within sight of the virtually undefended summit of Chooks Bear, and then, tragically, inexplicably, General Johnston gave them the order to stop.
What's happened? Stand upon us. You better send us now. If the Turks get back into the trenches, we'll be cut to pieces. Just hang on,
It was understood that the Australians below at the neck could not succeed unless the New Zealand attack on the slopes above was coordinated. Even though the New Zealanders had stopped, the Australians chose to proceed.
I don't care what your watches say. Mine says they should have gone 3 minutes ago, so send them.
The pre-dawn scene at the neck is familiar to all who have seen the movie Gallipoli. The men were dismounted troopers from Victorian and West Australian contingents of the Light Horse. For most, this was to be their first major attack. Their optimism was raised by the nearness of the Turkish trenches and the success at Lone Pine. Their morale was raised by the firm conviction they could not let down their mates. Mateship was a powerful catapult, clearly more powerful than their proud individualism. However optimistic, they had all breakfasted on a cold ration of reason, which must have told them there would be few survivors.
Steady, lads! Wait for it!
Oh, well, of course, you know that. You know that, but as I say, I put it this way, I never remember a soldier refusing to go to his death on the field.
Lionel Simpson was in the first wave, carrying a plank to throw over the Turkish barbed wire.
I was in the lead, holding one end of this plank, and another cover was on the other end, and I pulled it away from him, and because I wondered what was so heavy, and he got shot in the leg, right in the knee. In fact, I could see the knee coming out with a machine gun, bullets going into it. I was going along. A bullet hit me in the left shoulder, went right in right on the point of the shoulder there. That didn't stop me because it went in and it bounced out. The men seemed to be falling behind me. You see, I was in the front. And the chap, one of ours, I could see about 3 yards up from me, fell down. he fell down, and I thought, it's time to get out.
Lionel Simpson turned around and, as he told me, ambled, fully upright, back to his trench. Evidently the Turks chose to spare him.
Those men should have gone, Barton. Marker flags have been seen.
Not by me, sir.
An attempt was made to call the attack off. There was confusion. One senior officer had been killed in the first wave, but the order was given to continue.
It's cold-blooded murder.
I said push on.
If there's an impression that the British ordered the attack persist, then that's plainly false. The order was given by an Australian officer, Colonel Anthill, pictured here. A fellow officer, Colonel Brazier, would later in correspondence complain angrily of Anthill's decision to persist with the attack. In these rear trenches, the young light horsemen from Western Australia could hear the crackle of Turkish rifle fire up ahead accelerate to a constant roar, sending shivers up their spines. But according to records, none of them hesitated. They all moved forward to take their turn. And I think to a new generation of Australians, the idea of throwing your life away so foolishly is incomprehensible, astonishing. But they were different times. The young men of 1915 believed they were doing their duty. And in this sense, I think the awakening Anzac spirit was full of mad contradictions. The men were proud of their individuality and independence, but they were also proud of an ability to die game. A second wave had gone, a third, and then in the sacrificial confusion, a fourth. Those few minutes at the neck would haunt survivors for a lifetime. Bean said it would not have happened later in the war. The New Zealanders, still halted, watched helpless from above. While they waited, the Turks reinforced the summit of Chooks Bear. Only then did the New Zealanders attack. On top of Chooks Bear, there is a monument to what is indeed a high achievement. The New Zealanders eventually took Chooks Bear, suffering far greater losses than the Australians at the neck.
If I were saying to ask to give a description of the colour of the earth on Chooks Bear on, say, the 9th or the 10th of August, I would say it was a dull browny red, and that was blood. Just dry blood.
Having finally seized these trenches, the exhausted New Zealanders handed them over to fresh British troops. The next morning, the determined, desperate Turks drove the British from Chooks Bear, and the August offensive was all but spent. Down at Suvla Bay, the British New Army, consisting mostly of untried soldiers, had come ashore to open yet another front. But Suvla was another expensive failure. The young, inexperienced British officers and men walked in dazed concert through the bullets and shrapnel. Their losses were heavy. The Anzacs spoke highly of the experienced British soldiers, but they were not impressed by Suvla.
They did that landing at Suvla Bay, which was a failure, and we never saw much of them after that, you know. We never saw them. They let us down that end, and we never let us down on the northern end of our positions.
No longer able to look forward, the men of Anzac began to look sideways. The New Zealanders had the dash of the Australians and the discipline of the British. They were widely seen as the elite at Gallipoli by all but the Australians. Charles Bean preferred his countrymen. He thought that the wild men of Australia made better soldiers. After Suvla, he spoke of not trusting the Tommy. The truth is, he says, After 100 years of breeding in slums, the British race is not the same. It is breeding one fine class at the expense of all the rest.
Compared with Dominion troops, British troops are 3 or 4 inches shorter, and that hits you in photographs. I mean, many of them are sort of slum children. They've been brought up and hammered into submission, and Bean notes how whenever British troops meet Australians, they call them sir, because they are larger, and they seem to have that natural authority which the typical Britisher, whether he's a factory worker or a agricultural labourer, has had knocked out of him. So the passivity, the poor physique, and the lack of initiative, regrettably, seems to be a pretty well-proven fact.
But in death, they were all the same. In graveyards all over Gallipoli, the Anzacs and British lie side by side. 2,700 New Zealanders, 8,700 Australians, and 28,000 British. And they probably would have lost a great many more, but for the intervention of this man. An Australian journalist, Keith Murdoch, briefly visited Gallipoli in September. He returned with a dispatch which exploded in the galleries of Westminster and Melbourne with all the force of a naval broadside. Gallipoli was one of the most terrible chapters in our history, Murdoch said. He was unrelenting in his criticism of the British General Hamilton, who had led a series of armies into a series of cul-de-sacs. He savaged the British General Staff for ghastly bungling, pomposity, and incapacity, accusing them of wallowing in luxury while the men died. He identified how they had frequently underestimated the opposition and persisted with hopeless plans. Most of all, he persuasively argued that the entire campaign was a miserable failure.
The Murdoch letter comes close to a declaration of independence. There is nothing restrained, measured, or discreet about it, and in this sense it's a masterpiece of plain speaking. It's passionately pro-Australian and vitriolically anti-British, or rather anti-British high command. What can you expect of men who have never worked seriously, Murdoch says. His dispatch is over 70 years old, but even now, even still, it carries a sting.
The sour note that the Murdoch letter left, which I'm afraid endures to this day, are the libels against the British, which are still deeply resented in Britain, and a part really of some of the mythology of Gallipoli, particularly in Australia. And that, I think, is the sad aspect, but there was a positive one, that it's very easy for people sitting in London to look at a map and say, well, here is a campaign going on. Here was someone writing in admittedly exaggerated terms and very vehement terms about what the reality as he saw it was. And he wasn't all that wrong.
Murdoch had done what censorship and good manners had prevented the others from doing. He had broken the rules of gentlemanly conduct, and General Hamilton was furious. Hamilton politely replied to the letter, offering some sensible objections, but he had no answer to the thrust of Murdoch's attack. Murdoch is not a gentleman, he said, and that was supposed to explain everything. Clearly, gratefully, the age of the gentleman had all but passed. The British cabinet took heed of Murdoch's views. Churchill's enemies were grateful for the ammunition, and there was no doubt relief that the attack had omitted themselves. So orders were given for the investigation of a safe withdrawal and the sacking of General Hamilton. The approach of stormy winter weather began to make life at Gallipoli even more unbearable. The men had little winter clothing. When the snow arrived, some froze to death in their trenches.
Well, it was cold. Yes, it was cold. We had a very big fall of snow there in November, you know. And the first time, it was the first snow that most Australians had ever seen.
And you can understand we're in all shorts. The trousers we used to wear used to be like riding breeches, and the lice were that thick that we cut them off above the knees. Consequently, we were in shorts. And when the snow came, we were 3,000.
There was talk of some fanciful schemes to break the deadlock. One British politician, Hankey, suggested they use high-pressure hydraulic pumps to flood the Turkish trenches. But after Lord Kitchener's visit, it was decided the best course of action was retreat. Various schemes were devised to convince the Turks that the trenches were still manned.
When we got down onto Anzac Beach, we got onto the pier there. There was a temporary sort of pier had been built on that to run the barges alongside. And on that pier, I remember, they had layers of unused sandbags, empty sandbags. I remember on the beach, so as they wouldn't hear the men's feet on the pier.
As many as 30% casualties were anticipated. In fact, only 2 men were slightly wounded. The planners had discovered a talent for organisation and attention to detail at the wrong end of the campaign. No matter how you look at it, the evacuation was a remarkable success.
Haberimiz olmadı. Haberimiz olmadı. Yalnız silah sesi yok. Top sesi yok.
When we heard that the idea of evacuating from the peninsula was first mooted, the fellows simply would not believe it. And it took a long, long time to convince them that that was in the minds of the heads. They could not understand 2 things. One was withdrawing in front of an enemy, and the other was leaving their cobbers behind. You don't know how that hurt the blokes.
I wouldn't like to say that. If they were, that's their bad luck. I know. I was happy. It was one of the happiest days of my life to get off that place.
I remember my personal feeling was, once my back was turned to the Turks, that I wanted to run. And everybody, I think we did that journey from Queen's Post down to the beach in much quicker time than was allotted to us.
Sabah aydınlandı. Ondan sonra kılavuz koyardılar. Baktılar ki seferler bomboş. Gitmişler.
Many of the Anzacs left behind gifts for their enemy. One soldier carefully laid a table with a meal and a recording of the Turkish patrol on a gramophone. Curiously, by this stage in the campaign, the invaders had developed a unanimous, unswerving respect for the Turks.
There wasn't any, I would say, personal hate against the Turks. I can't see that, and I don't think anyone had that personal hate against the Turks. But they were a part of an organisation, if you like to put it that way, of wanting the success of the British arms. It's just success of, well, it's like going to the races. You don't like backing losers, do you? I don't.
O da kendini emir almış gelmiş. Biz de emir aldık. Ondan sonra geleni sokma. Buraya demiş. Biz de ona göre sebat ettik. O da geldi, uğraştı. Bir sefer çekildi gitti. Hiç nefret etmedi, hiç.
The retreat from Gallipoli brought only temporary relief. So many Gallipoli veterans went on to other battlefields. Gallipoli had seemed like hell, yet it was barely an initiation. Australians went on to fight bigger, bloodier and more futile battles in France. The British also had little time to count the cost of Gallipoli. In one single day on the Somme, almost as many British died as in the entire 9 months at Gallipoli. The General Staff were frustratingly slow learners when it came to seeing the folly of throwing good men after their bad mistakes.
It's rather horrifying to read the private correspondence of generals. The assumption is, right through to 1918, that there's plenty of men to replace those who are killed, that men are dispensable, they simply don't enter calculations. It's only in 1918 when the Army and the Cabinet, I mean, Lloyd George and Company had very little respect for men. It's only in 1918 when the source of men seems to be drying up that generals suddenly start taking loss of life into account.
Britain has erected few monuments to the Gallipoli campaign. In Turkey, in a sense, they are everywhere, in every park, every village. After all, the Turks won. And Gallipoli turned a comparatively inconspicuous colonel, Mustafa Kemal, into a national hero, Kemal Ataturk, father of the Turks. His tomb is the centerpiece of the new national capital, Ankara.
Her ülkenin, her milletin kendi tarihinde geçen olayları kendi takdirlerine göre kutlamaları kendi haklarıdır. Nasıl ki onlar bu savaşların başladığı günü kutluyorlarsa biz de 10 Ağustos'u o en son zaferle neticelenen 10 Ağustos gününü biz de orada Çanakkale'de kutluyoruz.
There can be few precedents of former enemies paying such high tribute to one another. Australia has named a park opposite the War Memorial after Ataturk. The Turks have formally given this place the name we gave it, Anzac Cove. The British cemeteries at Cape Helles and Suvla Bay are carefully maintained, but they are lonely places. Most of the tourists here speak with broad accents and have that unmistakable casual air about them. The British are convinced Australia has a befuddled obsession with Gallipoli, and perhaps they are right. The Australians who come here appear certain that the mission is important, but uncertain about why this is so. Perhaps it's simply that here is a piece of ground in Europe we can relate to, a rare space in European history we can safely wander into.
We're young.
He's on 19.
19,
The cemeteries are full of familiar names. I found a chapel, a lily, 3 masters. There are Hawkes and Frasers. There are wine growers from the Barossa Valley and cane growers from North Queensland. And their children's children walk among them. There may be among the visitors a vague comprehension that Gallipoli changed Australia. We became more mistrustful of authority and we became less British. Making sense of Gallipoli is as difficult for this generation as it was for the original invaders. Extracting honour from defeat is a difficult process, but it does have a refreshing originality. This fatal shore is a monument to how close we will drift towards insignificance. Gallipoli had many elements of Vietnam's dirty war, except our losses at Gallipoli were far worse. At Gallipoli, we were the invaders. We were part of a puppet army. We went there willingly. The British made dreadful blunders, but so did we. There was costly, pointless loss of life. But anyone who visits Gallipoli and who speaks to these men could not fail to admire them. But they are the first to resist the fuss. They are still noticeably awkward about the subject of Gallipoli. I found them reluctant to delve deeply into their memories. They were inclined to suppress the experience. They were reluctant, as Australians are, to raise themselves high.